It's so good to be here and see all of you. I just thought last night, if I left yesterday evening, I would have had a full heart already. And I don't know how full it can possibly be after another few days with all of you. Dave Clarke got in touch with us about, a year and a half ago, when I think Joe put out a message saying if anybody wants to share something about themselves, story or whatever, that we could put on our website, please do. And Dave got in touch with us, and I was doing the interviews then, or my Zoom interviews, and I had the best time talking with Dave and studying about what he was working on, which is very near and dear to my heart, the mind-body connection of health. And the Zoom we had was really, really satisfying. And then when it came time to look at speakers for the reunion, I suggested that Dave be one of the speakers because I thought that all of us could benefit from what he is going to be sharing. I want to just share one little story because it's totally in line with what he's going to be talking about. Just last week, I was having lunch in my little tiny town of Stevensville, Montana, with a colleague that I had been doing some writing coaching with. I hadn't seen her for 2 years. Her husband had recently died. She had been caretaking him. That's why I hadn't seen her. But we had lunch, and she shared about her husband's passing. And then a little later on, she was talking about how she was going to this doctor and that doctor because she had pain in her thighs. She's our age. And they couldn't, and she was listing all these doctors and all these practitioners that she'd been going to because she couldn't figure out what was going on with her legs. And then I said, when did this start happening? She said, about 6 months ago. And so later on in the conversation, I said, Annette, have you considered the connection that's when your husband died? And she said, well, yeah, I have, but I don't know. I'm going to another doctor this week and blah, blah, blah. And I didn't pursue it any further, but if we see each other again, which I'm sure we will, I may, because I want to share Dave's book with her. Dave, as an introduction to Dave, he is the president of the Association for Treatment of Neuroplastic Symptoms. He's also assistant director at the Center for Ethics and Clinical Science, and he's a clinical assistant professor of gastroenterology emeritus, both at Oregon Health and Science University in Portland, Oregon. He's board certified in gastroenterology and internal medicine and practiced gastroenterology in Portland from 1984 to 2009. During that time, he diagnosed and treated over 7,000 patients whose symptoms were not explained by organ disease or injury. Dave has lectured extensively on neuroplastic symptoms across North America and in Europe. His book for patients, They Can't Find Anything Wrong, was praised by a president of the American Psychosomatic Society as truly remarkable. He has done hundreds of interviews for TV, radio, and podcasts, and was an executive producer of 3 documentary films. Let's welcome our classmate, Dave Clarke.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Martha. And thanks to all the people that volunteered to create this weekend for us. I'm so grateful, and I can't even imagine how much work they have put into this. And I feel very honored to be here today, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to start with the fact that I only remember one grade that I got at Williams. But in a strange way, it affected my medical practice many years later in ways that I never would have predicted. But we'll get to that story in a bit. What I really want to start with is in the 1980s. I was practicing gastroenterology in a hospital in the suburbs of Portland. And I was very happy with that. I thought I would continue there for the rest of my career. But then I was asked to see a 50-year-old woman who had been admitted to the hospital the night before with an attack of severe vomiting and dizziness. And when I went to see her, she said something to me that I've never heard from any other patient, which was, "Thank you for coming, doctor, but don't waste your time." You'd be better off seeing your other patients. And when I asked her why, it turned out she had good reason, because she had been having these attacks 6 to 10 times a year for the last 15 years. And she lived in Palo Alto, so the hospital she got admitted to for about half of these attacks was Stanford University Medical Center, where she saw a dozen specialists, and when they got frustrated, they had her see a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist pronounced her mentally healthy and sent her back to the medical specialist, where she continued to have her attacks. And so here she was in the hospital, and the last thing she said to finish her discussion was, "They can't find anything wrong with me," which later became the title of my book, as you've heard. Well, I couldn't resist a challenge like that. So I said, well, you know, I've kind of had a special interest in lost causes, and why don't you give me half an hour and tell me your story one more time? And she just sighed, and her husband was sitting there, and he looked down at his shoes, you know, like, here we go again. But less than an hour later, both of our lives were changed. And we'll get to exactly how that panned out in a bit. But now I want to go back to this grade that I got at Williams, which, you know, when I was a freshman, you know, unlike all of you, I was clueless. I had no idea what I was going to do with myself later in life, especially after Williams. So I took all kinds of classes for which I had no aptitude whatsoever. One of them that I suspected I probably did have some aptitude for was an English class, and it was a class on cinema from Professor Samuels. Maybe some of you took that as well. And the very first paper that I wrote for Professor Samuels, he gave me a D+. To this day, I don't know what I did to earn the plus. But I went to see him in his office hours, you know, basically to say, what the hell? But I was, you know, more polite than that. And he started explaining to me the many dimensions of my ignorance in great detail. You know, that there was so much about character and story and humanity in general that I had no comprehension about. And he was explaining this for a pretty long period of time. You know, he could have stopped right with the, you know, woefully ignorant part and said, you know, you really need to transfer to some place with far lower standards, you know, like Amherst, for example. But he didn't do that. You know, he basically took a great deal of time to educate me in that moment. He didn't have to, but he did. And because he did that, he was basically sending me the message that, yes, you are ignorant, but yes, you can learn. And that was an important lesson. And I got that lesson over and over again through my Williams experience. I got it especially from Professor Kramer in psychology in the personality assessment class, from Professor Bell in a Shakespeare class when I was already safely in medical school and didn't have to worry about the grade. But that was an excellent class, the one on Shakespeare, and learned a tremendous amount about character and story and humanity from those classes that I never thought I would use again, because I was going to medical school, I was going to be into organs and structures and biology, and, you know, what does psychology have to do with that? And I got, you know, really a good experience in medical school. It certainly wasn't as huge a challenge as pre-medical courses here. And it was also, I was well prepared by the Williams College trivia contests, in which I was an avid participant. And basically the first 2 years of medical school are just a daily trivia contest. So I was fully ready for that. And really didn't have to confront my ignorance again until the 8th year of my training. And by the 8th year, you really know a lot. I mean, I was certified in medicine by then. I had a license. I could go out and practice. And I thought I pretty much knew everything that I needed to know, except the extra training I was taking to be a gastroenterologist. So the last thing I expected was to encounter a patient that I didn't know the first thing about diagnosing or treating. But that's what happened. A 37-year-old woman was sent to us from UC San Diego because I was at Harbor UCLA Medical Center in Torrance, California, and they sent her to us because they could not figure out why she was averaging 1 bowel movement per month. Sorry about that, but if you invite a gastroenterologist to come and speak to you, we'll try to keep that sort of thing to a minimum, but that was her problem. She was taking 4 different laxatives at double the usual doses and wasn't doing anything. So they sent her to us because we did some highly specialized testing of the neuromuscular function of the large intestine, and we did that fully expecting it would show what her problem was, but when that test was normal also, we were at a loss, my department chair and I. And it was left to me to go and talk to her and basically do her exit interview and tell her she was going to have to live with this. But I didn't want the conversation to be over in 30 seconds, and so for whatever reason, I fell back on character and story and humanity and just started talking to her about her life. And she really had no stress going on in her life at that time. She was happily married. She had 2 kids. She worked part-time in a bank, and really everything seemed to be fine. But eventually she trusted me enough to share with me that she had been severely abused as a girl, age 4 to age 12. And I had never heard that before. It's embarrassing to admit that as a physician, nobody had ever taught me anything about taking a history like that or what to do with it if I ever heard it. And I certainly didn't think it could be related to her illness because the abuse had stopped 25 years in the past, and her illness had only been going on for 2 years. But fortunately, I knew of a psychiatrist there at UCLA named Harriet Kaplan, who had an interest in these mind-to-body conditions. I didn't know anything about them myself, but I knew she did. So I got her an appointment with Harriet and forgot all about her and went on with learning how to put endoscopes in people. Until 3 months later, I ran into Harriet in the elevator ride that changed my career, because between the ground floor and the 5th floor, she told me she had cured this patient with about 10 weeks of weekly counseling sessions. And the idea that you could alleviate a serious physical condition just by talking to somebody was, again, a completely foreign concept. Again, it's embarrassing to admit as a physician that nobody taught me anything about this, that you could do this. But I thought, okay, well, the reason obviously that I haven't ever heard about this before is that these patients must be rare. But I was still shocked. And when I got off the elevator, I turned around and I said, Harriet, how did you do that? And I was intrigued, and I thought, if I'm going to be a complete doctor, I should know how to help people with this condition. So Harriet kind of became a mentor for me. She came and hung out with us in the outpatient GI clinic. And she gave me, over the next year and a half of my training, a basic framework for how to think about these things. I never thought I would use it all that much. I thought maybe 1 or 2 patients a year, perhaps. But I was glad to know what to do for them. But when I did get into practice, there were 2 more surprises. One was that there were no Harriet Kaplans in Portland, Oregon. There were only people who did cognitive behavioral therapy, and that turns out not to be very helpful for this condition. And the other thing was that there were a lot more than 2 patients per year. Without even trying, using Harriet's framework on any patient who didn't have an organ disease or didn't have structural damage, I would start asking the questions that I had learned from Harriet, and I was finding 5 or 6 patients a week that had these problems. Not necessarily as severely as that first patient, but there were a lot of them. And the whole concepts about character and story and humanity became much more prominent in my practice after that. But I was still a bumbling beginner for a long time, for a number of years. And I kept thinking that sooner or later somebody was going to come along and put their hand on my shoulder and say, Dave, you don't have to do this anymore. We have people who are trained for this. We have people who know how to do this. They are going to take over from now on, and you can go back to putting endoscopes inside of people, which I was doing with 2/3 of my patients. But I just kept thinking, this can't be right, that somebody trained as a technical specialist would be doing this work with patients. There's got to be somebody out there that knows how to do this better than me. So that was my state of mind when this 50-year-old woman from Stanford was brought into the hospital. And I kind of knew by then, had a decent idea of what kinds of things to look for. And it turned out there were only two pieces of information that were needed to understand her problem. And the first was that she had been verbally and emotionally abused by her mother, starting at age 3 or 4. Parents divorced around that time. Mother got sole custody. But the patient, unfortunately, resembled the father. And the mother hated the father. And a lot of that anger got displaced onto the patient. And it went on all through her childhood, all through her adolescence, and it was still going on. The patient was 50 years old, mother was in her 70s, and mother was still verbally and emotionally abusing her. So you have to imagine the level of emotional tension in that relationship. But you had to imagine it because you couldn't see it in this patient. She was talking about all this stuff in the same tone of voice you would use to read a grocery list. No emotional presence there at all in this. But clearly it had to be there. So the second piece of information was that although most of her attacks of dizziness and vomiting happened in and around her home community in Palo Alto, she would always get one of her attacks whenever she passed through a little town about 40 miles from where she lived. So I think the first thought most people would have is, well, does mom live there? Turned out mom did not live there. Nobody of significance to her lived there. There were no toxic waste dumps there. It was just a quiet little suburb in the East Bay, but it always triggered one of her attacks. And nobody, not even the Stanford psychiatrist, could figure it out. But it was, I figured it out with a fairly simple question, which was, well, if you always get sick when you go there, why don't you avoid it? And she said, well, it's on the way here, meaning Portland, Oregon. And why did she come to Portland, Oregon? Well, her mother lived there. So I said to her, I think what's happening is that you've got a lot more emotions involved in your relationship with your mom than you might recognize. And when you're getting in the car to come visit your mom, which was about once a year, and you're thinking about, or at least subconsciously reacting to this visit with your mom, by the time you get 40 minutes down the road on the way, it's starting to really hit you and making you physically ill. And I thought this was, a really smart formulation for what was happening. And she just kind of looked at me and said, well, I'm not really sure. Until I asked her one more question, which was, well, first I asked her, what happens when you drive home? And she said, well, we go home by the coast. We like to see the California redwoods. So she didn't go through the little town on the way home, so I couldn't use that. But I said, what happens if you drive 40 minutes in some other direction? And you're not going to see mom. And you're going, this way or that way, but you're not going to see your mom, and you're going 40 minutes. Do you ever get ill? And she realized at that moment that she didn't. She could drive an hour and 40 minutes. As long as she wasn't going to visit mom, she'd be fine. And that was her light bulb moment. I can still remember her looking up at the ceiling and going, oh my God. Because that was the first time that it ever got into her conscious awareness just how much emotional tension there really was. And the wonderful thing about this story is that just bringing that into her conscious awareness was enough to alleviate her symptoms. When I went to see her on rounds the next day, she was already gone from the hospital. And she called me a year later to say she'd gone the entire year with no attacks, even been able to drive through the little town without any problem whatsoever. So that was a great outcome for her. But what was good for me was that I finally realized that, and I went home to my wife that night, who's here today, and said, Linda, I think I am onto something. And I just stopped worrying about somebody coming along and putting their hand on my shoulder, and I made this an integral part of my practice. It was 35% of the patients that I saw for a couple of decades, and was a very rewarding part as well, because these were patients who had mostly not been helped by the healthcare system. This condition falls into a giant blind spot in the system The mental health professionals aren't comfortable with people who are physically ill, not usually trained in that. And the medical professionals are not trained in the kinds of framework that Dr. Kaplan had taught me. And so these patients, as Nancy was just talking about, they go from doctor to doctor looking for answers and usually not finding them. And then there are scores and scores of companies that are marketing solutions for people with this condition that are of little value. So it is something that is growing in recent years, but back in those days, in the 80s and 90s, it was just a vast empty space in the system. So I know there are a number of people here that want to find out more about how the process for diagnosing this condition, and so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. The first thing I do, of course, is make sure there's no organ disease or structural damage that's going on to explain the symptoms. The next thing I do is get the chronology, when and where did the symptoms start and what's been their pattern over time, and is there any connection I can find between a stress or a trauma going on. One of my patients, for example, that had symptoms 3 times in her life, age 22, 31, and 37, and they all turned out to be by far the most stressful times in her life. When she wasn't under a high level of stress, she had no symptoms. But sometimes it can be even simpler than that. One of my patients, and none of his other doctors found this out, but he was only having his symptoms when he was driving to work. See, you've diagnosed him already. But just to clinch it, when he drove home from work, he was fine. And on the weekends, he was fine. Another patient, this is a story told to me by one of my colleagues. She had developed in her mid-60s pain in both buttocks. And she'd seen many doctors. They hadn't been able to figure it out. She came to my colleague, and he said, "Was anything stressful happening in your life at that time, the time that it began?" And she said, "Well, it was around the time that my husband retired." There may be some identification with that in the room here. Sometimes it's slightly more complicated. There was another gentleman who was referred, after people found out that I was doing this work and was happy to see people who were medical mysteries, they started sending me patients who didn't have any kind of gastrointestinal problems at all. And this was a gentleman with daily back pain for over 25 years. He was quite elderly. He was 72, I think. Unlike myself, a youthful 71. But no, I should advise everyone that there is a very clear medical definition for elderly. You may not be familiar, but it's very simple. Elderly people are those who are at least 15 years older than you are. And this becomes true at age 15, still true at age 47, still true right on up through the spectrum, so you're all looking very youthful. But he was 72, and he'd had this back pain for over 25 years, and there really wasn't much going on with his spine x-rays, and nobody could understand this. But I found out that he didn't have it every single day. There were 2 weeks out of the year when he was pain-free. What do you suppose he was doing during those 2 weeks? He was on vacation. But I didn't want to jump to conclusions too quickly, thinking maybe on vacation he rests his back carefully on a warm beach somewhere, and that's why his back doesn't hurt. So I said, "What do you do on vacation?" And he said, "Well, he fly fishes in British Columbia." So he's wading out there in the river. He's, casting the rod back and forth. He's reaching down to net the fish. And then he's wading back out of the river. And then he tells me when he's done fishing for the day, he's helping the lodge owner clear brush from behind the lodge. Is he having any back pain when he's doing this? Not a bit of it. But as soon as he gets back to his normal, high stress, hard working environment, the back pain comes back. So it was very clear that that was not structural back pain and that we needed to do something about his ability to recreate the relaxation of the fly fishing environment on a more regular basis for him. Other people, it's a little more disturbing. I look for trauma, and very frequently people have not been asked about this, and very frequently they don't share it themselves unless you ask directly. A colleague of mine from Tucson tells a story about a woman with 6 months of fairly severe symptoms that brought her from doctor to doctor throughout that period of time, and nobody asked her about trauma, and it turned out her husband brought it up and said, right before she became ill, she had been a hostage during the robbery of a store. And for 30 or 40 minutes, she had a handgun pointed at her neck, right before all these symptoms began. She didn't think to mention it to anybody. None of the doctors thought to ask her about it, but this comes up fairly often. Another patient of mine, she had symptoms for 5 years, and one of the features of her illness was that a couple of nights a week she was waking up at 1:08 in the morning. And it was never 2:08, and it was never 1:09. She'd wake up, look at the digital alarm clock, and there's a certain level of consciousness going on when people are asleep, and something triggered her to wake up at 1:08 in the morning. And it turned out that right before her illness, her husband and her parents had been in a serious motor vehicle accident. She herself was not in the car. The parents were killed, and the husband spent 6 weeks in intensive care before finally making a full recovery. But because of a damage to a watch, it was known that the car accident had taken place at 4:08 in the morning in Connecticut, and she was in the Pacific time zone. So she was waking up at the exact moment of the accident, and was still, after 5 years, still suffering post-traumatic stress from that event. Another patient had 3 years of abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting attacks. They would last for up to a week. They would happen every couple of months. All the tests were normal. And when I asked her where the pain was, she formed her hand into this shape and pointed at the right lower corner of her abdomen as to show me where the pain was. When we got to the part of the history about trauma, she told me that she had witnessed the shooting of her brother, and he had been shot in the right lower quadrant of his abdomen and hemorrhaged to death in the ambulance. The bullet lacerated the major artery that takes blood to the leg, and he didn't make it. But this had happened a full decade before her symptoms began, so it didn't seem to be the obvious trigger, but it had to be connected somehow, because there was no way that she would be making this kind of a gesture and having her pain in exactly this place when her brother had been shot in exactly that place. So I asked her if she could think of any triggering event that happened right before her illness began. And right away she knew, because right before her illness began, she had encountered her brother's killer in a store. Completely unexpected. He had been arrested after the shooting. It had taken place in the context of a tavern brawl. He was convicted of manslaughter. He was sent to prison. And then a decade later, he was released, and nobody warned her that he was out there. So when she encountered him, it was completely a shock. And her illness began soon after that and carried on for the next 3 years. A couple of other areas that are important to look into are anxiety and depression, which can manifest physically instead of as a mental health condition. They very commonly manifest with more physical symptoms than with mental health symptoms. A lot of these patients will tell me, I don't feel depressed, but they're stressed, they're exasperated, they're frustrated, and they're desperate for me to uncover the cause of their physical symptom, whatever it is. And the clue is that they have other symptoms of depression. It's more than just feeling depressed. It can be not sleeping well, your appetite being off, losing interest in things you used to love to do, feeling like your life is not worth living, crying for no obvious reason, lots of other symptoms that go along with it. In fact, my personal record patient for number of symptoms, he had 27 different symptoms that he was suffering from simultaneously. Came to me with a printout from the internet, and he'd circled all these things that he had, and his diagnosis for all of those was depression. Anxiety is another one that people say, no, I don't feel all that anxious. And it's often because they've felt so anxious for so long that it just feels normal to them. But the clue there is that their symptoms are much worse or more frequent whenever they are away from what they consider a safe environment. So one of my patients, her home was a safe environment, and she only had symptoms away from home. When she was at home, felt perfectly well. Another patient, severe diarrhea, 16-year-old girl. On her bad days, she would restrict herself to water only in her diet. And she was taking up to a dozen anti-diarrheal tablets, Imodium, if you're familiar, by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The normal amount is, no more than 8 in 24 hours. And even with all that, restricting to water, a dozen Imodium tablets, still having diarrhea on her bad days. But none of her other doctors had learned that her bad days were on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Now, the large intestine, the bowels in general, do not know what day of the week it is. It's dark in there. We have to bring our own light. So only your brain knows what day of the week it is, and which means the brain is involved, which means very likely an anxiety disorder. And she had a source of really extreme anxiety, which was that she played varsity soccer, and the games were always on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and she felt really anxious about her performance in those games. If there was no game on a Thursday, for example, if it was just practice, she'd be fine. On the weekends, she had no symptoms. There were no games on the weekends. She had no symptoms at all. So it was very clear that the brain was involved there, that it was an anxiety disorder that was going on. So I gave her some counseling and some prescription for an anti-anxiety medication. And her mom was sitting there listening to all this and seeing me write this prescription. And she said, "Aren't you going to do any tests?" But when you have diarrhea that's only on Tuesdays and Thursdays, in the textbook, there's like 50 different causes of diarrhea. But there's only one that will do it to you on Tuesdays and Thursdays only. And I told her, this medication that I'm writing a prescription for is completely useless for all other 49 causes of diarrhea. So if this medicine works, it's the equivalent of a diagnostic test. And she had no further symptoms about 10 days later. It takes a while for the medication to kick in, but she did great after that. So anxiety, depression, stress, trauma, and I've left the biggest category for last. And the biggest category is the long-term impact of adverse childhood experiences. They're called ACEs in the jargon. And they're very common. Half the population has had at least one, and 15–20% of the population has had 4 or more. And it turns out the more of these that you have, the more likely you are to suffer physical symptoms as an adult. And there's a whole long list of different things that people suffer who've had a lot of ACEs in their background. But it's very prominent in the patients that I work with. And you can't obviously go back and change the past, but you can intervene successfully with some of these long-term impacts. And the long-term impacts fall into 3 major categories. The first is personality traits that can be highly stressful for people. Kids who are trying to survive an adverse childhood environment, they don't have that many options for what to do to make it through those environments or try to fix those problems. So they often become very detail-oriented. They try to be the best kids they can be. They are highly self-critical if they fail. They can become perfectionists. Their self-esteem suffers. Their focus on the needs of everybody else in their world to the exclusion of their own needs becomes very strong. They often have difficulty asserting themselves or setting boundaries around toxic individuals or situations. And all of these things, they needed in order to get through some of these difficult environments. One of my patients had an alcoholic father, and starting at about age 8, she tried to deal with his alcoholism by hiding his liquor bottles. And that's not something an 8-year-old should be doing. And she typically failed over and over again because he would always find the hiding places. And she felt terrible about herself for not having cured his alcoholism, or at least prevented it, and carried that with her for well into her adult years. The next major area of long-term impact are what we call triggers, which are people, situations, or events that are highly stressful for people because they are in some way linked to the adversity of the past. And the most common example of that is that a parent who was abusive, for example, is still in the patient's life at the present day. One of my patients was the only child of a single mom. And the single mom suffered from severe depression, and this patient, as a girl, worked very hard to try to manage and alleviate her mom's depression as much as she could. Didn't always succeed. Mom attempted suicide 3 times while the patient was growing up. And the last of the 3 was fairly violent, and she was the one who found her mom on all 3 of these occasions. But now, she's still living at home, age 32, but she has a fiance, and the fiance is asking her to come live with him. And mom is saying, if you go and live with your fiance, I don't know what I will do. Just unbelievable pressure, and not a surprise that she began reacting physically to this. Another patient who had been hospitalized for a total of 7 or 8 weeks over a 9-month period of time for various gastrointestinal conditions, had seen 3 internal medicine doctors, 2 gastroenterologists, and 2 psychiatric nurse practitioners. And nobody could figure out why she kept having these episodes. And so I asked her one of my standard questions: did anything stressful happen to you when you were right before you became ill? And she said, yes, my dad had a stroke, and his rehab was difficult, and I was over at his place 3, 4, 5 days a week trying to help him out. And that was obviously a big load for her to carry, a lot of stress involved in that, but it didn't seem like it was quite enough to put somebody in the hospital for 7 or 8 weeks. It was scattered over about a dozen different admissions. And so I asked her, well, do you and your father get along normally? And she said, no, I've been trying to avoid him for most of my adult life. Oh, why is that? And she's told me this story that when she was 6 years old and her little brother was 4, mom and dad went off to Las Vegas for a long weekend. And she was left to stay with an aunt and uncle. On the Sunday that mom and dad were due to come back, they called up the aunt and uncle and they said, we're getting a divorce and we're not coming back. And that was the last she saw of her parents for the next 20 years. And she was passed like so much unwanted baggage from one relative to another. So again, plenty of reason for enormous emotional tension in that relationship, and now she's feeling obligated to go and give him support. And when she does that, it's kind of just, another example of her dad's narcissism, is that whenever she didn't do things exactly the way he wanted her to, he was critical. He would tell her, you're doing this wrong, or you're doing that wrong, or you need to do this in a different way. So just taking a knife and sticking it into the hurting part of her, and it's no surprise that she became physically ill over that. So the third major area of long-term impact, and I've already alluded to this, are the emotions. But they are typically repressed emotions. They are typically emotions that people don't fully recognize they have. People can have tremendous amounts of anger, fear, shame, grief, guilt, which they're not aware. I often make the analogy of these patients being like dormant volcanoes on the outside with boiling magma on the inside. And we have to help people recognize those emotions that are going on so that they can then put them into words, either spoken to a therapist or written on a piece of paper or a computer screen, converting the emotions that are being expressed into their bodies in the form of symptoms into words. And one of the exercises that I often have my patients do is write a letter that they don't mail, but they write it to the parent or parents who mistreated them. And when they do that, they are converting a bodily expression of emotion into verbal expression, and their symptoms often improve. One of my patients had an abusive father. He wrote the letter to him, took it to his father's grave, and read it to him. out loud. And it said it took him 4 or 5 hours to read the whole thing. And by the end, he was shouting. But when he did that, after he did that, his symptoms were 90% better. So it can make a huge difference. Other people, they're going to need to talk to a therapist for a period of years. I mean, I love to tell this story about the patient from Stanford who got cured in an hour, but there's a whole other end of the spectrum, and many people, just a measure of the severity of what they've suffered, that they need long-term psychotherapy. So there's quite a range with this. Other triggers, other emotions. We probably have time for one about grief. Fear is another one. But the grief story that I remember the best was a patient who, at age 17, she was at a family picnic on the California coast at a park where there's a huge cliff, 200 feet high, that overlooks the ocean. And while her family was at the picnic, her dad got up, walked to the edge of the cliff, and kept going. And the whole family saw it. And it's shark-infested waters up there off Northern California, and his body was never found. 25 years later, she's 42, and she has extremely severe pain in the right upper corner of her abdomen. But one of the clues that it was what we call today neuroplastic, meaning brain to body, neuro meaning brain and nervous system, and plastic meaning capacity for change, that it was a neuroplastic pain, was that it was in a very tight area. It was about, extremely severe pain, but in the area of about the size of a silver dollar. And if you had the gallbladder's in this area, but if you had a gallbladder attack, it would typically smear out over a much wider area. The tighter the focus of the pain, the more likely it is to be neuroplastic. And that was the case for her, because her pain started on roughly the 25th anniversary of her father's death. And she was still living in the home that she had grown up in, the home that her father had lived in. And she told me that every day, at the time of day when her father would typically walk home from the local mill and would be coming up the street, she would go to the porch and look down the street to see if he was coming. So she had a tremendous amount of grief that just simply had not yet been resolved. Okay, I think I'll stop with the most of the clinical stuff there and just talk briefly about the pathway that I followed since that time, because somewhere around 15 years into doing this, I realized that I was only seeing a fraction of people that had these issues. This is 20% of the adult population, 50 million adults in the US. It's 40% of people who go to a primary care doctor. And I knew that I was never going to be able to see more than a tiny number of those. So I started a class for patients who were referred from mostly primary care doctors that might have a stress component to their illness. And it started very slowly, but it grew because the patients who came benefited from it. They went back to their doctors and told them that it was helpful to them. The doctors were encouraged to send more. And pretty quickly it was growing at about 50% a year. Finding a room big enough was beginning to become an issue. But it was also becoming an issue for the administrators and the lawyers where I worked. The administrators were concerned that I was spending so much time listening to people instead of putting endoscopes into them. And the lawyers were concerned that I didn't have a formal credential in psychology. So after 7 years, and with us on an exponential growth curve, they canceled the class, which really annoyed me, as you might guess. But for any of you that are trying to change the world, when a door closes, find a window or find another door. And I decided that if I couldn't teach people directly, I would teach them indirectly, and I started writing my book. I took Friday afternoons off and started writing. And as you've heard, I'm not exactly a natural writer, so it took me 3 years to write. And somewhere along the way, I got connected with Tracy McIntosh, class of '74, whom some of you may know, who read the manuscript and gave me some good advice, which was, it's good, but hire an editor. And that sounded like a C+ to me, so I was glad after 30 years I had made some progress with my writing. But I did hire an editor, and she helped the book a lot, and sent the manuscript out to people I admired to see if they would endorse it, and they did. And the publisher said, these are really good endorsements, you should go on a national book tour. But before you do that, you need media training. So I went and took a 3-day media training course from a guy who was a leading radio talk show host in, actually the #1 radio talk show host in Los Angeles. He's one of the 5 smartest people I have ever worked with. But on the first day, everybody got a turn to take 3 minutes to talk about their subject. And I'd been doing talks on this for 20 years, so I thought I was pretty good at it. And when I finished my 3 minutes, he looks over at me and he says, and he was not soft-spoken, he says, Dr. Clarke, your material is great, but your delivery would put an orgy to sleep. I repeated that story. We're good friends now, and I still work with him every other month. And I repeated that story back to him earlier this year, and he just practically fell off his chair. But he helped me a lot. The book tour was very successful. I went to 12 cities in 6 weeks. I did over 100 broadcast interviews, lots of speeches. The book was very successful. I started getting invited to give talks all over North America and Europe, but the most important of those was the smallest. It was only 30 people, Ann Arbor, Michigan, March of 2009. And it was the most important because the only people who were there were people who were doing this work. And most of us had never met anybody that was doing this. And the people in that room were from the full spectrum of health and mental health professionals. And we had all found this not through, any of us through our training, but through learning on our own, pretty much. You know what? I forgot to tell you one of my favorite stories. Well, we don't have time for it. Oh, well. It was a guy with total body itching. But when I tell this story, people in the audience usually start scratching themselves. If you see me scratching myself, it's not because I have neuroplastic symptoms. I've been very fortunate never to have suffered them myself. But my wife and I, in the last week or 10 days, have been doing a lot of hiking in northern Maine and New Hampshire. And the mosquitoes on those trails gave me a Michelin star for cuisine. In fact, in the mosquito community, I think I'm still getting quite the buzz. I just wanted to make sure you were alert out there. Just a little cognitive assessment that I'm throwing in here. But yeah, it's such an amazing story. He had total body itching for 3 years. And he went to the neurologist, he went to the dermatologist, he'd seen at least half a dozen of them. And when they sent him to me, I had never seen a patient with itching. I had never been asked in my professional career ever to evaluate somebody with itching. So I just had to trust that the other doctors had done a good job and made sure that there was no organ disease or autoimmune condition or other problem that was responsible, so that I could just focus on the stress. And all I did was I said, sir, this problem you have, it could be stress related. I don't know if it is, but why don't you tell me about stress in your life, past and present, and I'll see if I can figure something out. And he told me his story, which was that he was an unwanted child, basically. He was 11 years younger than his next oldest sibling, and his parents made it very clear that the last thing they wanted was to raise another kid. So he grew up in basically an emotional desert until his sophomore year in high school, when he met his wife Helen, and she was the first person in his life who ever cared for him, and they were just like devoted to each other. The strength of their mutual commitment was beyond what you usually see even in the best of marriages. And they did great for decades, but then she developed a rare cancer. It's called Sézary syndrome, for those of you that are physicians. And one of the features of this is that the malignant lymph cells get into your skin and cause total body itching. So, okay, that's the giant screaming clue. But I have learned that the best thing to do when the giant screaming clue appears is to shut up and listen. And so he carried on with the story, which was that he was a very strong Christian, very religious. And when it looked like his wife was not going to make it, he got down on his knees and he prayed and he said, Lord, if you save my wife, I will take her itching. And the next thing that happened was a miracle, because a new oncologist took her case, gave her an investigational drug, and she went into remission. And the itching went away for her. But both sides of his prayer were then answered. She was saved, her life was saved, and he got the itching. The whole time he was telling me this story, you could tell he thought this visit was going to be a waste of time. He was sitting on a chair, he was leaning forward like a linebacker waiting for the snap of the ball. The whole entire time he was telling me the story. And so I said, I think what is happening here is that the itching means that both sides of your prayer are being answered, which means that as long as you keep itching, your wife is going to be okay. The Lord is going to protect her. And he sat back in the chair and he said, Doc, I think you might have hit the nail on the head. So, how do you treat that? I'm not going to get in between him and his God. So I said, you might want to think about or talk to your pastor about whether after 3 years of this intense itching, you have suffered enough. And, I can't, as a physician, say anything about that. It's something you have to think about for yourself. And 3 weeks later, I called him up. I had high hopes that his itching would be relieved. And he said, it's 95% better. And he was holding on to the 5%. So I thought that was a good outcome. All right, so getting back to the Ann Arbor conference, we spent the weekend, the 30 of us who had found our way to this work, sharing stories, finishing each other's sentences, and we decided we had to start a nonprofit. And you've heard that the name is currently Association for the Treatment of Neuroplastic Symptoms, and it's grown ever since. We have for anybody who's wondering if they have their own personal symptoms or the symptoms of a loved one might be connected to any of this, there's a 12-item questionnaire on the symptomatic.me website. The more questions to which you answer yes, the more likely it is that your symptoms are coming from this neuroplastic process. We have courses, we have 2 textbooks. The textbooks currently use an older terminology of psychophysiologic disorders. We have a new podcast called The Story Behind the Symptoms, where I interview people who have suffered from this and try to uncover the underlying issues that are responsible. We've got monthly Q&As on Zoom with experts that people from around the world attend. We've had 3 documentary films, but the most important single thing that we did was we sponsored some research, because you don't change healthcare practice with stories, no matter how good the stories are. You have to have a controlled trial where you compare the treatment you think works with the previous standards. And we couldn't get anybody to agree to do that, because it just seemed as unbelievable to them as it did at one time to us, that you could alleviate serious physical symptoms just by talking to people. But eventually, we found somebody that sort of nibbled at it. And 3 of us from our board, myself included, talked to them as much as they would listen. And we found out later that they thought all 3 of us were crazy. But we came from 3 very different personal and professional backgrounds, and they noticed that in spite of that, all 3 of us were crazy in exactly the same way. So they said, okay, we have a study ready to go. We can add 50 people with chronic low back pain to the study, and you can try your method and see if you can alleviate the back pain better than the 2 control groups. The only catch is that you have to pay for it. And it's because we're scanning people's brains as part of this study, which is expensive. It's going to cost $100,000. And my 2 colleagues and I did not have that lying around. So we crowdfunded it. We made a little video. We went on GoFundMe, and we reached out to our community. And we got $125,000 in about 4 months. And we basically told people, look, if you believe in this, you have to put your money behind it. Now is the time. And we had over 500 donors from 24 countries. And we gave the money to the researchers and said, okay, it's your money, you study it, we're gonna take a step back and see what the results turn out to be. And the results were astonishing. These are people with 10 years of back pain. You just have to imagine, you know, the back pain is going on and going on and going on, and then all they got was 1 month of treatment, twice a week, 1 hour each time for 4 weeks. And the pain scores dropped by 75%, and maybe 5% in the 2 control groups. This was 4 times bigger than had ever been seen before with a psychological approach to chronic pain. And there were lots of studies of cognitive behavioral therapy that showed, you know, a little bit of a bump above placebo, but not much. This was huge. It got national publicity, Washington Post, CBS News, lots of other places. But the most important thing was it unlocked research dollars from big institutions. And my board member, who's a researcher, and his research partner, they had been knocking on the door of the National Institutes of Health for years. But when we had this study, which was published in a prestigious journal, JAMA Psychiatry, when that came out and they could point to that, suddenly $3 million became available. And this study has been replicated and corroborated and confirmed from Halifax to Harvard to Detroit to UCLA. So we've got a lot of accumulating evidence, and there are more studies in progress. The guy who conducted the Boulder back pain study, which was the one with the 75% drop, he's got 4, 5, or 6 studies ongoing right now because he's been able to get so much money for this. So it was a huge game changer for us, that crowdfunding. And the last story I want to tell is about our annual conference. We held it in Boulder last year. 270 people from 8 countries came. And while we were planning it, a feature film director from Hollywood reached out to us and said that she had been incapacitated by chronic fatigue for over a year. She was practically bedbound. She could crawl to the bathroom and back to her bed, and that's all she could manage for over a year. And then she found our approach, and you know, none of us personally treated her, but she recovered just using what she found from the resources that we have. And she was so grateful. She said, look, I want to come and make a video about the state of your field. And we said, of course, great. And she came to our conference. She set up in a room at the venue, a studio, and we asked for volunteers to go in and tell their stories, whether they were researchers or clinicians or patients. And they all came in for 10 or 15 minutes each. They told their story. 110 people volunteered. She got over 20 hours of footage. And if we start now, we'll be done by 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. But for those of you that have other plans, she did edit it down to 7 minutes. I'm going to show you that now.
Hi, I'm Jenny. I had 23 years of chronic pain. 5 years ago, I couldn't walk more than 3 blocks. Now I hike easy 12 miles, salsa, pickleball, all the things.
Hi, my name is Alec Casson. I'm a former semi-pro cyclist, and I used to be partially bedridden on strong painkillers. And now I do 500-mile bike trips without even thinking about my back.
I used to suffer from chronic back pain, and it was difficult to get out of bed. And now I run every day and play with my daughter.
I received a diagnosis of long COVID. I couldn't walk or talk.
Now I can run, I can dance.
I was diagnosed with tendonitis in both of my wrists.
Now I can sit all day long at my computer and run my company.
Unable to get out of bed. Now I can rock climb.
Like I'm stronger and better. I don't feel as afraid.
Jump, I can do anything I want.
Recovery from knee pain was dramatic and overwhelming.
Say 17 migraines a month to none.
Just about to run my first full marathon.
I performed on Broadway with no pain.
Now there's nothing I can't do. It's a whole new life.
I'm Dario Zagar. I'm a neurologist with Yale University.
I'm Dr. Becca Kennedy. I'm former lead of the Long COVID Clinic at Kaiser Permanente Northwest.
I'm Yoni Ashar. I'm a neuroscientist at the University of Colorado.
All pain is real, and all pain is generated in the brain. These things are revolutionary ideas.
There's new science about how pain is made. Pain is not made out in our body by our nerves.
So if you put your hand on a hot stove, the hand actually sends signals up through the nerve pathways into the brain.
The brain picks up on that neurochemical message and then begins to communicate with other parts of the brain saying, hey, I think we've got a problem here. We need to pay attention to this.
Most of the time, the brain does a pretty good job at letting us know when there's a threat or injury to the body and creating pain to protect us. Don't touch the fire, it's hot. But sometimes the brain gets confused.
I think it's helpful to think of the idea of safety and threat.
We now are learning that pain is really a protector. It's a signal from the brain that we are in danger.
And that when it feels like it is under threat, which may happen because at times it was, it can continue to perceive sensations or feelings or experiences as being threatening.
Coughing is a good one. Let's say you're sick, you have phlegm in your system, and you need to get it out. So your body, as a survival mechanism, we've developed the capacity to cough. So maybe 15 years ago, I got a virus and I was coughing, and that's, quote unquote, a danger signal or my body's way of alerting me to a certain threat. And for 2 weeks I was coughing, right? There was an actual reason for it. But after that, it caught. So even after the danger or the threat was gone, my brain was actually still interpreting danger. So I developed a chronic, what we call neuroplastic cough, where I was actually coughing for the next 3 or 4 months. There was no reason for it. My brain was actually interpreting danger where there was none, and I was coughing. And when I realized that it was essentially a false alarm, I was able to overcome it.
The Boulder Back Pain Study found that of the people we treated with chronic back pain, average duration of pain was 10 years. 3/4 of them were virtually pain-free in 1 month. In a study at Harvard, Mike Donino, our colleague, found that 2/3 of the people he treated, again with chronic low back pain, were virtually pain-free within a couple months.
In my recent study at UCLA, nearly 2/3 of patients with chronic musculoskeletal pain had a clinically significant improvement.
At Northwestern University, they scanned the brains of people who had recently injured their backs, and they found that the brain activity associated with back pain was in the pain processing parts of the brain. But then they followed these people for 1 year, and half those people got better, but the other half had developed chronic pain. And when they scanned their brains again, they found that the pain had shifted to a set of regions related to emotion and learning and meaning making, and they basically caught on camera, using a brain scanner, this transition from acute to chronic pain, suggesting that once the pain has shifted to these other set of brain regions, its activity in those regions can cause the pain to continue on loop.
The fear of the symptoms is a really big driver. It's what the loop basically is you have the symptoms trigger the fear of the symptoms triggers the fear.
Pain gets really learned in the nervous system, and just as we can learn symptoms, we can unlearn them.
I thought, there's no way. There's actually no way I can change my brain and address these incredibly severe and debilitating symptoms.
It's understandable to have doubts about this. This is new science. What we're doing here is on the forefront of biomedical science. But the studies that are coming out and the research that is growing and being published, the results are just phenomenal. People are recovering from all kinds of chronic pain, long COVID, all kinds of chronic symptoms.
Migraines.
Chronic fatigue syndrome.
Post-concussive syndrome.
Symptoms blamed on chronic Lyme.
Food sensitivities.
Dizziness.
Pelvic pain.
POTS.
Fibromyalgia. Sciatica.
Bladder pain.
Digestive problems.
Plantar fasciitis.
Tremor.
Brain fog.
IBS. Skin disorders. I could go on and on and on.
It's the biggest blind spot in healthcare, and it's a problem that's got a solution.
And the beautiful part of this is when it's a nervous system problem, We can help you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Matt McClanahan, and I've successfully treated hundreds of patients.
I have seen hundreds of people heal from these methods.
Probably at least 80%.
80% to 80%.
The majority of my patients, the majority.
Hundreds of patients. Hundreds of patients.
Thousands.
Dozens.
Over 7,000 people successfully improved.
I have thousands and thousands of people who were formerly hopeless that are completely well.
This is a paradigm shift in thinking. It is a radical new way to think about the body.
A lot of this is so counterintuitive to everything we've ever done.
My patients tell me this is a real revolution. I can't believe how limited of a life I lived and how tragic my future looked.
We're going to look back at the way we treat chronic pain now, the way we look at, using leeches in the Middle Ages. Like, everything's going to change.
I want the world to know that we really can rewire the brain. Just get the word out.
Thank you. The level of severity you can get with this condition is just astounding. One of my patients had a completely paralyzed stomach, not the abdomen, but the organ of digestion. The muscles of it were not contracting at all. Another patient had abdominal pain for 79 years. Both of those patients were successfully treated. Another one, 55 years. And within 30 days, he was well. Another patient I was asked to see, 17-year-old girl, hospital day number 70, getting morphine around the clock, every hour getting a dose of morphine that would normally be more than sufficient to alleviate the pain of a fractured leg. And she was getting it every hour. And I was GI consultant number 7 over the previous 18 months. She was successfully treated as well. She was out of the hospital in a week and off of all opioids in 30 days. So there's a tremendous amount of hope for this. Anybody here who would like to reach out to me, I'm at drdave, Dr. Dave at symptomatic.me, and I'd be happy to correspond with you. Thank you very much for coming today. All right, let's leave 3 minutes for questions. Yes, Dave Feiner.
Dave, you highlighted this hole in medicine and medical school training. What do you think needs to be done in connection with medical school training?
What needs to be done in connection with medical school training? Well, the research that's been published has gotten the attention of medical educators, and we're now seeing this appear in the curricula of more and more institutions. I personally have taught in 4 or 5 different graduate schools, including my local medical school for the last several years, but it only happened when that research was published. So that's another way that it's made an impact. It's being taught, surprisingly, in both medical schools in Slovenia. The dean there found out about this, and he loved it, and he started it in his medical school over 10 years ago. But he told me that changing the curriculum of a medical school is like moving a cemetery with the aid of the inhabitants. So it takes time. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I wonder whether you've had any pushback from the narcotic manufacturers, folks who are making money, treating patients.
Yeah, narcotic manufacturers and the whole invasive medical industry. The success rate for surgery for low back pain, for example, is 27%. In spite of that, the rate of surgery on chronic low back pain is rising. So there's a tremendous amount of money in doing invasive procedures and in prescribing opioids. We hope that we will get pushback from them. Right now, we're too small to be noticed. But we live for the day when people are worried by us, because we're coming.
Dave?
Yes?
Are you familiar with the work of Louise Hay?
Yes. Some of it is scientifically based, and some of it is a little bit far out there. We try to be very strictly... Yeah, sorry, the question was, am I familiar with the work of Louise Hay? And it's not 100% scientifically based. So we try to base our approach strictly on evidence that has met the highest standard, and not all of her stuff. I mean, there are a lot of books out there that just kind of leave the science behind. Hers is kind of a blend of solid ideas and not so solid ideas. But the one example is the #1 New York Times bestseller in any category earlier this year, and maybe still, was called Good Energy. Some of you may have seen it. It is a combination of advice that you would get from your mother probably, and a bunch of complete nonsense. And one of the co-authors of that book has recently been nominated to be our Attorney General. So the books that we put on our website, we have vetted very carefully to be based on the evidence. Yes?
How do you find a doctor in your local community who thinks the way you do? And also, when you were treating somebody with an itch, and you're a gastroenterologist, how does insurance recognize that as a valid service?
Yeah, finding clinicians who do this work, we have a directory on our website of people that we have vetted to a certain degree. We are not in a position to be able to certify people, but we look at their personal reports of the training and study that they've done, and if we think they meet a reasonable level, we put them in our directory. There's only a couple hundred on there, and they're certainly not available in every community, but some of them will treat patients via telehealth, over the internet. So that's a possibility. You can also, ask your doctor if you've reached a point where investigating for your psychosocial stresses and working on those might be useful, because a lot of doctors, they're afraid to, mention that possibility to people because they're afraid of getting tossed out of the exam room. But if you bring it up and they say, yes, I think we've done a thorough evaluation for organ disease and structural problems, then you can feel confident using the resources that are on our website that I had no access to when I started, but are now numerous and valid and cover this from multiple angles. So that's one way to get the care that you need. There are apps now too. There's an app called Curable, and there's an app called Digestible that are both very much evidence-based that can be used. Plus, the books and the courses. A lot of people get better just from those. We've had people who have recovered just by reading a book or two. Other people need, much more than that. In terms of the billing issues, usually we can find a diagnosis that will fit the insurance paradigm. We're working on trying to get the insurance paradigms to recognize this and make it easier for clinicians to bill for it. But most of the time, if somebody comes in with neuroplastic symptoms, you can find a category that's acceptable to the insurance companies, whether it's irritable bowel or fibromyalgia or long COVID or chronic fatigue or migraines or various forms of dizziness. And the gentleman with itching, I think we labeled him as having a suspected biliary problem, because if you have a biliary problem, you can get bile salts in your skin, which can cause itching. So that was the pretext for him. But the truth was that the people who have that condition have a particular blood test called the alkaline phosphatase that is sky high, and his was normal. So we knew it wasn't that. But we could still, put a label on it. Yes, sir.
I understand the pattern in your finding the causes of many of these ailments, but I'm not clear on the pattern for the treatments. Does it depend on each individual?
So the question is, what is the pattern of the treatment? And it depends on the particular stress that the individual is suffering from. And if it's something as simple as getting pain when you drive to work, he was quite relieved when he saw that connection. And in and of itself, just knowing that it was connected to stress in his workplace was helpful. And it also empowered him to go to his supervisor and say, look, we need to make some changes. This is causing me physical pain. But other people, much more complicated. If they've got the long-term impact of adverse childhood experiences, they're going to need, more sophisticated help for the consequences of that. A big part of what I do is with that group is to help people recognize how much they overcame. One of the points that I failed to make in the regular talk is that many people, when I ask them about their childhoods, because none of us has a parallel life to compare ourselves with, when people look back, they are thinking to themselves, it wasn't that bad. Other people have been through worse than me, or it was so long ago, I think I'm over it now. But then I will ask them, well, what if it was your own child or another child that you care about? What if you were a butterfly on the wall of your childhood home and you were watching your own kid go through exactly the same stuff that you did? How would that be for you? And people get a much more realistic sense from that exercise. And that can start them growing their own self-esteem about how much they overcame, to think about their early experience as if they had parachuted into the Amazon jungle as a toddler and somehow had to find their way out. And the self-respect they can build from that kind of image of it makes a huge difference. It has a ripple effect in multiple other areas of a person's life. I get some interesting consultations, and to abbreviate it a bit, I found myself in a bar in Beverly Hills with this impossibly good-looking woman who had been suffering 5 or 6 neuroplastic symptoms for 20 years. And she told me that her childhood was pretty much fine. There were some issues, but not really anything bad. But it turned out that what it was her parents verbally and emotionally fought with each other on a daily basis. And she was the only child, and from a young age, she was the peacemaker, and continually failing time after time after time to make an impact. And she was saying, it wasn't that bad. And then her parents divorced when she was 8, and you would think, okay, problem solved, right? No, they kept living in the same house. Slept in separate bedrooms, of course, but they kept at each other. And so for the next 10 years, she had to deal with that. But she's telling me, no, it wasn't. But she started having neuroplastic symptoms at the age of 16. And she had lots of the personality characteristics of somebody who had suffered ACEs. And it was only when I asked her to imagine her beloved niece. She had a niece that she absolutely adored, 5 or 6 years old. And I said, all right, imagine you're a butterfly on the wall of your childhood home. Your parents are fighting, and your niece is in there, and she's trying to deal with this. And you can't do anything because you're a butterfly. You just have to watch your niece try to cope. What would that be like if you did that for, let's say, a week? And she just stared at me. She was an actress, very verbal person, but just completely stopped talking and stared at me while she processed that. And at the end of a couple of minutes, she said, at the end of a week, I would shoot myself. And that was the first time she realized just how difficult it had been. And that was the start of a major change. One of the long-term impacts of ACEs is choosing toxic partners for yourself, choosing people that have needs or problems or issues, and you end up in an unbalanced relationship where you are giving vastly more than you are getting back. And she had been in one relationship like that after another. But after she did this exercise, she dumped her then boyfriend the next day. Yes?
What's the best way to follow up on this?
Best way to follow up on this, we've put everything, we've completely revised our website in the last 8 months. So symptomatic.me is a real hub for lots and lots of resources around this. Yes?
You made a couple of references to cognitive behavioral therapy. As a layperson, I've always had the impression that's a pretty effective therapy, but it sounds like in what you're encountering, maybe less so. Or is it dependent on the person's circumstance?
No, for this particular condition, it turns out not to be. This CBT ends up being more about helping people live with their condition than actually changing it. And in the best current study, UCLA, very tough group, older male veterans, very diverse ethnically, and the success rate of achieving their pain relief goal for CBT was in 17% of their subjects. For this new form of what we call neuroplastic recovery therapy, 67%. A huge difference. Never been seen before, that kind of separation. Yes?
Dave, one more question, only because we'd love to stay here all afternoon. Someone's coming in after us. So one more question. And
Good point. Thank you, Counselor. Yes.
I'm struck by a lot of parallels from what you're talking about, and I wonder if somewhat how this is connected somewhat to our educational system or our graduate system, because as a psychologist, my training in graduate school was you ask these questions. And as a result of that, it was only when someone started to change the questions we're asking that we started to acknowledge that there was a great deal of childhood sexual abuse going on, that there was a lot of dissociation going on. But we were told that this is what you ask. And only when you loosened up and you started to ask other questions did you get a better sense of reality. And that's kind of what you've been doing in terms of asking other questions, not just going down through the biological checklist of what causes this problem. And I'm not sure what the point I'm making is, except that I think in terms of our education and our graduate education and our trainings, we have to be more flexible and be saying that we don't have the answers, and part of our responsibilities in any profession we do is we have to start asking different questions to get a better picture of what's really going on.
Yeah, so the comment is that we need to be flexible in asking different sorts of questions than we might have been trained to ask, and to try to bridge this gap we have between the people who are trained in mental health and the people who are trained more in physical health. And I couldn't agree more. I think it was actually an advantage to me not to have any formal psychological training, that it did force me into 3, 4, 5 years of trial and error that were, very difficult. But at the end of that, I came out with an approach that was successful. Thank you all very much once again.
Yes.